Rome, 47 AD, two aristocratic women are the talk of the town. One is called Messalina, the other Agrippina the Younger. Members of the imperial family and ambitious, they want power in a world that denies it to them. They will leave a mark on the world for wanting to govern themselves in the place of a husband or son. Chroniclers describe them as mad, nymphomaniacs and criminals. As is often the case with the great figures of ancient history, it's not easy to distinguish between legend and reality. So almost 2,000 years later, what do we really know about Agrippina and Messalina? The first thing we know about this story is that it took place in ancient Rome. Today it's just ruins, but 2,000 years ago it was the capital of the world. Messalina and Agrippina were heiresses of the man who founded the imperial dynasty, Augustus, the first emperor. Each gave birth to a pretender to the throne, Messalina with Britannicus, Agrippina with Nero, who would reign. At first, Agrippina seemed to be the best place to win. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, while Messalina was only the great-granddaughter of Octavia, Augustus's sister. In other words, the ancestry of her son Nero was a little more prestigious than that of Messalina's son Britannicus. However, fate decided otherwise first. According to the accounts of the time, written decades afterwards, life was not kind to Agrippina. Her father was murdered and her mother tortured. Her brother, Caligula, is said to have had an incestuous relationship with her. In the year 28 AD, Agrippina was 15 years old enough to be married. Her family linked her to a certain Aenobarbus. He was a brute. She hadn't chosen her husband, of course, because this was a Roman aristocracy where marriages were arranged. Aenobarbus bore her a son, the future Nero. In the year 37, Caligula, Agrippina's brother, became emperor. As a result, the young woman was getting closer to supreme power. At the palace, she began to weave her network of political friendships. Caligula suspected her, not without reason, of plotting against him. Agrippina, fallen from grace, found herself separated from her son Nero and exiled to an island off the coast of Rome. In the year 41, there was a dramatic turn of events. Caligula was murdered with his wife and child by his bodyguards, the Praetorians. With no direct heir, he was replaced by his uncle Claudius, a Roman aristocrat born in Gaul at Lugdunum, the present-day city of Lyon. He was chosen somewhat against his will by the Praetorians to become the new Caesar, but Claudius was married to Messalina. There was little or nothing known about her childhood. It was barely known that, like Agrippina, she was descended from the imperial family. She was about 15 when her husband Claudius became emperor. That same year, she gave birth to little Britannicus, and she soon developed a taste for power. Her son was now the rightful heir to the throne. It's true that Claudius wasn't the freshest. He was 35 years older than Messalina, and he was very shy. He wasn't exactly the idea of an emperor, but that didn't matter to Messalina. With Claudius, they embodied the power of the Roman Empire. Together they reigned over a state of 54 million inhabitants, an empire built with the force of the sword, from Gaul to Palestine, and from the Rhine to the Sahara. Meanwhile, Agrippina had become a widow. She was recalled from exile by her uncle Emperor Claudius. She was back in Rome, where she was reunited with her son Nero. She reconnected with her network of influence and married a wealthy politician who died shortly afterwards. The year was 47. Agrippina now had the means to think about her future. For her most cherished desire, according to the very slanderous Roman historians, was to attain supreme power. Never again would she be an outcast, an exile. She approached Pallas, one of Claudius's main advisors.
Mais dans mon cas, la passion et l'ambition se combinent merveilleusement.
This clever calculation brought her closer to the emperor. Agrippina now regularly saw Messalina in the corridors of the palace. The empress was suspicious of her return. Rightly so, because Nero, Agrippina's son, could one day claim the throne that Britannicus was to inherit. So Messalina tried to get rid of this rival by spreading the worst rumors about her. But Agrippina was a shrewd tactician. She took the blows and avoided public confrontation by remaining in the shadows. For the moment, the empress was in a position of strength. When she advised the emperor on the decisions he needed to make, he listened to her, even if it was about politics.
Je t'ai demandé de me laisser réviser la liste des sénateurs, avec ceux qu'il fallait chasser et ceux qu'il fallait conserver. Est-ce que j'ai été efficace?
Ça m'a surpris de constater le nombre de petits détails que tu connaissais à propos d'eux.
Of course, ancient sources were quick to accuse the First Lady of manipulating her husband. Messalina, as we said, loved power. She always wanted more. It wasn't an easy thing to accept for the Romans, a bunch of macho men whose language Latin gave rise to the word patriarchy. To build her network, Messalina had to use stratagems. Her assets were her wealth, her intelligence, and her charisma. The chroniclers who later wrote the history of Messalina described in detail the way the empress conducted her politics. According to them, she bought the support of powerful men, knights, and senators. Those she couldn't corrupt, she compromised by seducing them. And there was no question of resisting her. The empress didn't allow it. The recalcitrant were eliminated without mercy, but whether they were true or imaginary, Messalina's alleged excesses ended up worrying the Roman elite, notably Claudius's advisors, who now considered that the empress was harming the imperial power.
C'est ignoble, j'ai quelque mal à le croire.
Je ne voulais pas prêter attention aux rumeurs qui circulaient, mais cette fois, je suis révolté. Il faut absolument faire quelque chose.
And now feelings were getting in the way. In the year 48, 20-year-old Messalina fell madly in love with the consul, Silius. Together they decided to risk everything. With the help of part of the Senate, unhappy with Claudius's policies, they hoped to provoke a coup d'état in their favor.
Et si nous nous marions? Que se passera-t-il?
Nous avons des amis puissants. Ils partagent nos dangers et s'efforceront de nous apporter la paix.
While Claudius was away, Messalina asked for a divorce and the same day married Silius. She wanted to show the emperor's weakness, the better to overthrow him. But the freedmen exposed the plot, warned Claudius, and Messalina fell. She was brutally murdered, no doubt on the orders of Pallas, who, being cautious, didn't give her time to talk to her husband. Her death reshuffled the cards of power. As a worthy heir to the Caesars, Agrippina immediately took action. Barely a year later, in 49, she married the Emperor Claudius. Her rival's ex-husband, Perfect, who also happened to be her uncle. Thanks to the support of Pallas, she had managed to seduce him. It wasn't too difficult. Agrippina was rich, she had a network of powerful friends, so the emperor thought she could help him consolidate his own power.
Mais j'ai besoin d'une femme de tête. Alors, ça te plaît toujours?
Absolument. Mais je ne serai jamais une potiche, je tiens à te le dire. Si tu m'offres le pouvoir, je l'utiliserai.
The young woman had one objective, to push Nero onto the imperial throne. Firstly, because he was her son, and she thought she'd be able to wield power through him. Secondly, because Nero was a direct descendant of the first emperor, Augustus, and Agrippina believed that he was the only one capable of carrying on the dynasty. But there was an obstacle. Young Britannicus, the son of Messalina and Claudius. Agrippina would try to weaken this official heir, so that Nero would be able to take his place. The new empress had no scruples. Like in Messalina's time, those who got in her way or opposed her were ruthlessly exiled or murdered. Her growing influence over Claudius allowed her to do so. Agrippina also arranged for the education of Nero, whose tutor was Seneca, philosopher, statesman, a great mind of his time. Meanwhile, Britannicus had to make do with bad teachers. Too young to defend himself, he was slowly but surely being pushed aside. Agrippina convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, an essential step if he was to overtake Britannicus in the race for the throne. Finally, in the year 54, the emperor died suddenly following a feast attended by Agrippina. It is said that she had his favourite dish poisoned, mushrooms. Nero was immediately proclaimed emperor by the Praetorians. The following year, it was Britannicus's turn to die during a banquet at Nero's house. This time, Agrippina's victory was absolute. No one was left to challenge her son.
Tout ce dont j'ai pu rêver va enfin pouvoir se réaliser.
59, 5 years after becoming emperor, Nero couldn't take it anymore. His mother, who so skillfully placed him at the head of the empire, was in fact wielding all the power.
Je t'en prie, tais-toi. Comment veux-tu que je te réponde si tu ne te tais pas?
For Nero, who had always lived in Agrippina's shadow, it had become unbearable. The unthinkable happened. The emperor ordered his mother's assassination. He first tried to disguise the murder as a shipwreck, but Agrippina survived this first attempt, so Nero had to send henchmen to stab her. A few years later, Nero fell victim to political intrigues and committed suicide. This put an end to the proud dynasty created a century earlier by Augustus. Messalina and Agrippina wanted to make their mark on history, and they succeeded, but the memory they left behind is ambiguous, to say the least. After their deaths, both were damnatio memoriae, banished from memory. This bad reputation has been passed on into modern times. So the word Messalina, which has become a common noun, still refers to a woman of dissolute morals in Latin languages. One thing is certain, those who told their story, such as Suetonius or Tacitus, were often senators, in other words, political enemies of the First Imperial Dynasty, and misogynists at that. So it's hardly surprising that they painted such appalling pictures of Messalina and Agrippina. They were reproached for ordering murders and their taste for power, but all things considered, didn't these two women with their strong temperaments behave in the same way as most emperors? In the end, if they were guilty, it's because they usurped a power that belonged to men. And so, 20 centuries later, the curse of Agrippina and Messalina is still with us.